Hello, my name is Crystal Schimpf, and I'm your host and presenter for this evening's workshop, Library Board Essentials for Advisory Boards. Now, this webinar is part of our series of trustee training opportunities for Colorado Public Library Trustees, and it's intended to help lay a foundation of knowledge and information for public library board service. I just want to thank you for joining me and for your dedication to your library. My name is Crystal Schimpf, and I'm a consultant at the Colorado State Library, which is a division of the Colorado Department of Education. I primarily work with public library boards and directors, and I started my career in libraries as a public librarian, and I've been providing training and consulting for close to 10 years now. So I'd also like to just tell you a little bit about the Colorado State Library if you've not had much of a chance to engage with us previously. You might be interested in learning about what we do. We're a unit of the Department of Education, and we're not a library per se, like your public library that you're on the board for is a library. We provide support and guidance to libraries, publicly supported libraries across the state, which includes school libraries, public libraries, and some academic libraries. And we are not a regulatory agency, so we don't tell libraries in Colorado how they should operate or what they are supposed to do. We provide resources to help them develop. My unit is called Library Development, and we provide resources to help libraries grow and to improve their services. We do have a publications library, which does have a collection of materials of state government publications from here in Colorado. But that publications library is not open to the public in the same way that a public library is. So they work a little bit differently. We also have the Library Research Service, which collects our public library data and does other research projects about library work. We have the Talking Book Library that serves the print and blind and print disabled users across the state through talking books and Braille and audio recordings. We also have the Colorado Virtual Library, which is our resource sharing unit, and where we provide news and information about what's happening in Colorado library community. We offer several special programs. Some of them you may have heard of previously. One Book Colorado, the State Parks Backpack Checkout Program, and also the Colorado Virtual Events Calendar are things that we offer through the state library. Another resource that we have available is our Trustee Handbook. Our Trustee Handbook is available online and in print form. I'll hold up just if you can see my picture there. You can see me holding up a copy of this. It's a little flip book. It has several pages of brief information about what it means to be a trustee in Colorado and some of the responsibilities related to being a library trustee. It's also available online, and I will include a link to this. So after this webinar, you'll get an email, and that will include several links, the copy of the slides from today's session, and one of those links in the additional resources will be to this pocket handbook. And I do recommend it. I'm happy to send you print copies in the mail. If you haven't seen this before, you don't have a copy, I can send some to you for you and your other board members. And it's just a good resource to have on hand that is very concise. Okay, so now let's just take a look at our agenda, what it is we are here to cover today. We've covered our welcome and our introduction already, and I want to give you a big picture view today to help you to be better prepared to meet the responsibilities of library board service. And we're going to pay special attention to library advisory boards and talk about what that means in just a little bit as well. So we're going to look at the concepts of governance and operations in the library and how that relates to library boards. We're going to look at the key roles and responsibilities for library advisory boards. We'll look at open meetings and open records laws, important things to know about if you're on a public board in Colorado. And then we'll also look at the core principles of public library service with a little bit of a peek at some library trends as well. And we'll close with some reflections and wrap up. And this is a 90-minute session tonight. We will get out of here around 6:30. But we might get out early, depending on the number of questions you have and the amount of discussion that we have as well. I also, again, will just reiterate, you'll get a chance to participate and ask questions throughout tonight, and you'll gain access to a link with a folder full of resources, an online folder full of digital resources that will include these slides and also a resources handout I'll just hold that up so you can see when you get this in digital form, it actually has links that you'll be able to click on in order to access all the information related to today's session. We're going to look at a lot of different resources today, so I'll also just encourage you to focus on what's going to be most helpful for you and not worry about capturing everything during our session today. You'll have these resources. You can look them up as needed later on. We just want to get the big picture of what information is out there and what's most important to be aware of as a library board member. All right, so and then one last thing before we begin our first section. I'm a librarian by training. I'm not a lawyer. And so the facts, information, and links provided in this presentation are for educational purposes and are not intended as legal advice and should not be used in place of seeking legal advice from an attorney should your library need it. So just keep that in mind as we go through here today. All right, so we'll begin our first section on governance and operations. And these are two concepts that work together to support the work of the library. And I like to look at the big picture here and think about how governance, the concept of governance, influences the operations of the library. And so looking at this chart, we've got 4 boxes and an arrow moving from left to right. I'm going to start on the left and talk our way through this. So first, the governance of the library must be informed by all of the applicable laws at the local, state, and federal level, as well as the standards and the values and the ethics of the profession. And then moving to the second box, the governing authority is the body that's responsible for setting policy and carrying out the fiduciary responsibility for the library. Now, in most settings where an advisory library board is in place, that is some city or county entity or a joint agreement between, say, a school and a city or a school and a county, perhaps. So that governing authority is where the authority lies for the library itself. And an advisory board, we'll look at this more in just a minute, an advisory board is typically not the governing authority, but might be involved in some of these governance ideas. So moving on to the third box, the policy is created by the governing authority, but often in partnership with the library director or led by the library director. And so it's then approved by that governing authority. And then that policy that is created provides the parameters for library operations, and that's managed by the library director. Policy also provides protections for the library organization, for library staff, and for the rights of library users. It creates clear definitions and guidelines, but it typically doesn't include everyday procedural details. So that's not something that's included in the policy itself. So let's look at this in a different way and start to think about how the advisory board fits into this. Now, the entity that is responsible for governance is called the governing authority. And so again, in municipal and county libraries, this is most often the city and county manager or city or county manager, or perhaps the city council or the county commission. It really depends on how the local government is run. And then on the other side of this line that we have here is the operational side, and that falls to the library director. The library director is hired to manage the library so that the governing authority focuses on the governance side and not the operational side. So there is a relatively clear line there. And then the library advisory board is most commonly going to advise the governing body, the governing authority, on behalf of the library and also the community. So plays sometimes a liaison role. And this may be in the form of making regular reports to the county commissioners or through written reports and recommendations to the city manager, or just being active in some meetings of some sort. It really does vary depending on how the local agreements are between the library board and the city or county, and also kind of the customs that are in place about how that is operated. Some library advisory boards actually have some authority to approve or sign off on policy, which is then further approved or ratified by the governing authority. And again, that just depends on the situation at the local level. Now, the library director manages the library staff. And again, managing staff falls on the operational side of the equation. So the library board and the governing authority are not responsible for that management of operations or staff. But one way that the library board typically interfaces with the library is by having some type of advisory relationship with the library director as well. So letting the library director know what they think about various situations in the community or how the library might be able to help out. The board may represent a voice for the community and may provide some insight into community needs and aspirations. So it still plays a very important role in the library ecosystem. Now, the amount of power and authority of a library advisory board is determined by local agreements. And we'll look at these later in the workshop. All library boards are granted certain powers and duties by Colorado law. But in many cases, an advisory board is not considered the governing authority. And so the powers and duties may be relegated to the city or county or school, however the library is governed. And so the board may function only in an advisory capacity in those areas. And some local agreements may be based in a tradition or a handshake or some mutual understanding. But it is a good idea to have a written agreement between the governing authority and the library advisory board, outlining what the board is responsible for and what authority they actually have. Now, maybe that right now everything is really smooth at your library and that there's no issues. But the challenge is that if the local government leadership changes, those customs might not get passed on, and then that could be challenging to say, well, this is the way we've done things, but there's no written agreement that reflects that. So having that written agreement reflects the current governance and ensures that the library is able to retain its power to support the library. Local agreements between library advisory boards and the governing authority are typically referred to as an intra-governmental agreement, IGA, and that's because they're between the parent government and a department or unit of the government. But they are also sometimes called a memorandum of understanding. So that is what type of local agreement you might be looking for. And just to share an example, this is a somewhat recently updated example from the Summit County Library Board of Trustees, and this is on their website, and it shows the level of authority that they have as an advisory board. And this is from their website, and like I say, they have a written agreement on file with the county that goes into a little bit more detail. But this says the library is a county department which abides by Colorado state library laws. The 7-member board of trustees is appointed by the Summit County commissioners. The members are selected to represent the geographic area of the county and serve a 3-year term. The board of trustees makes recommendations on policy and budget to the local government entity and acts as a liaison between the library, local government, and the community. So it's just defined what the role of the board is and a few details about how they're formed and established. Now, another document that's important for any board, including a library advisory board, is the bylaws. This document describes how the board operates and conducts its own business. Now, this is important even for an advisory board, and there are some articles linked in the resources that talk about bylaws for library boards. So it's a good idea to make sure those are up to date. And one last principle that I want to share in this section is that it's important that your board pay attention to its voting procedures and follow the one board, one voice recommendations. The Library Advisory Board should function as a body. So no individual on the board has individual power over decision making. Anytime the board makes a statement or a recommendation for policy or something in support of the library on an issue, it's a good idea to take a formal vote and to document that in your minutes. So the board, might not always agree on things, and the vote might not always be unanimous. And it's important for the board to act with one voice, though, once that vote is taken. Even if you personally disagree with the outcome, you shouldn't individually act to undermine the vote of the board. There's an article about this topic in the resources handout if you are interested in learning more about it. All right, so now we'll take a look at the key roles and responsibilities of a library advisory board. And we'll look at this in a few different ways. First, we'll just look at 6 essential areas of board responsibility. And I have these listed on your screen. We'll talk through each of them just briefly. And I'll just say that as an advisory board, these are areas where there is some responsibility for the board. Even if you don't have authority over these areas, you may have some power or some influence to have an effect on these areas to support the library. And so that's something to keep in mind, is even without the authority, you may still have some responsibility and some power and influence in these areas. And again, checking the local agreements to better understand exactly what the library board's authority is in your municipality or your county or your joint library is important, just to make sure that you know what's happening at the local level. So in the first box, we have fiduciary, and of course, it is important for both the governing authority and also the library board to make sure that the library is adequately funded and that there's responsible fiscal management of public money. So even as an advisory board, there may be some ways that you're providing some input on that. The next box is policy. So drafting, approving, revising library policy, which is going to govern the operations. Now, as a library advisory board, you may not be responsible for that final approval, but there may be opportunities to have input in the policy as it is revised. And so that's something to keep in mind, is how the board may have some influence or some input into the policy development for the library. As far as planning goes, as the library works on strategic or long-range planning, the library advisory board may be called on to participate in visioning sessions or strategic planning sessions to give input to the library director when asked, and to monitor and evaluate the overall effectiveness of the library and approve the strategic plan, or at least say that they approve before it's approved by the final governing authority, depending on, again, the circumstances in your local setting. And then in the next box is advocacy, fourth box. So being an advocate for the library in the community, speaking to community groups, championing the success of the library, and many other ways that the library board can just really be a support for the library in the community. And in some cases, you know, if there's an issue with funding at the local level, or an issue with something where the library is losing support from a city council or a county commission, if there are dire budget situations, an advisory board can really step up and speak on behalf of the library and help the other governmental units understand what it is the library is doing. So there's a really important advocacy role for an advisory board. Fundraising, being able to just support the fundraising work of the library. The advisory board is not likely or may not be involved in the actual fundraising plans themselves, but if there's anything you can do to support that, if there are ways to help cultivate donors or advise on grants or awards, that's an important role of an advisory board. And that's separate, I'll point out, from the fiduciary component. The fundraising is also often done in conjunction. If there's a Friends or a foundation for the library, then it may be working with that group. And so it does fall differently than fiduciary, which refers maybe more to the local taxpayer funds that are coming in. And then the last box that we have is the hiring and supervision of a library director. And this with an advisory board can really take on different shapes depending on what your local agreements are. So it may be that the advisory board has an opportunity to sit in on hiring panels or advise on the qualifications and the job description for that new library director. And that may not be the case in your local government. And that's, again, can really vary. But there also is an opportunity to maybe not traditionally supervise the library director, but to help advise the director and help them be successful, right? The advisory board can be a really strong partner for the director in helping them to improve and grow as well. And so hiring and supervision maybe aren't quite the right terms for an advisory board, but I keep it in parallel with what we say for governing boards as well. And so, you know, just thinking of that, like, again, what is the level of influence that the board has reasonably in that area, and how can you support that area, and, you know, especially with regard to supporting the library director. So another area where we look at the duties or the responsibilities of library trustees comes from the Colorado revised statutes within what we call Colorado library law, and that is in Title 24, Article 90, Section 109, where it talks about the duties of trustees. And I pulled in just a few items here that are, I think, of most of interest. And these are also included in that pocket handbook that I mentioned earlier, which you can access online and also get a paper copy of if you request it from me. And so these things that you see listed here, again, these are in statute for all library boards. Some of them, some of the specific items in the statute do reference or delineate between a library district or a municipal or county library, but many of them are just for library boards generally. But what often happens is that some of the power, some of these are delegated to the library director. It's an operational task. So particularly, where is it on here? Item number 7, for example, file an annual report with the state library. This is a statistical report. It is done by library staff in nearly all cases, unless there is not a library director in a very small library. The board might take that on temporarily, but that annual report comes into the state library, is done by library staff. That is delegated by the board. That authority is delegated. And then, you know, also in most municipal or county settings, many of the things you see listed in statute are relegated up to the governing authority. So the advisory board doesn't actually have the authority to act in these areas, but may have influence in them. And so, you know, for example, cause management of library property, that's a very legalese way of saying, you know, taking care of the assets, the physical assets of the library district. And this is something where if in a particular municipality, if there was an issue with maintenance and there was a need to get more support from the city and the director perhaps was having a hard time getting that, then maybe the advisory board could help advocate for more funds for capital improvements and really make the case for why that is needed for the library. Or maybe it's something like adding more broadband, you know, and so, you know, the board might have a voice in that. And so these are just things to keep in mind. I'm not going to read through every item on this list right now, but it's fairly detailed, but I will encourage you to take a look at this part of the Colorado Revised Statutes and learn a little bit more about what is in there, and then consult with your library director and your local documentation about what the local practices are in these areas for your advisory board. And then the last thing I'll share in this section about the roles and responsibilities is just to pause and think about the role of the trustee in the community. As an advisory board, this is one of the things that I think is both most important and most relevant to your role as a library trustee on the advisory board. And so again, I'm not going to read every one of these items. I am going to pause here for a moment, so you might get a chance to scan this, and I'm just going to call out, you know, some of the ones that really speak to me. And one of those is never miss an opportunity or occasion to build goodwill for the library. That's third up from the bottom. And also the third from the top, keep the lines of communication open between the trustees, the director, the community, and local government officials. So just being a communicator and connector with the community can really help support the library. Again, these come from that pocket handbook. So if you'd like to look at these in more detail, you'll have access to that later on and can request a paper copy. We'll keep moving along and look at open meetings and open records laws. And this is going to be a brief section. There's sometimes a lot of questions that come up around these laws, and I'm going to try to give just an overview and to not cross into the area of legal advice here. But I will say there are many resources that are included in the digital folder that you'll get a link to, and in the additional resources handout that you can connect to later on, and that kind of go into further detail on these topics that I think will also be helpful. So this is really just to give a high-level overview and help make you aware of what makes these laws important and what you need to know most about them. So we'll start off with the open meetings, or the Sunshine Law. And I'm going to start off just by talking about the purpose of the law, which is kind of stated in the statute in the declaration of policy at the beginning of the law. And it says, it's declared to be a matter of statewide concern and the policy of this state that the formation of public policy is public business and may not be conducted in secret. So in summary, that just states that public business must be open to the public. It must be visible to the public. It can't be done in secret. And so the specific details that are outlined in the law are that for a local government body, such as a library board, if there is a meeting of 3 or more, taking place, then that meeting must be open to the public, and there must be at least 24 hours notice for that meeting in a designated public place that's designated by the board each year. The minutes must be taken and posted for any public meeting. Now, there are exceptions for executive sessions where there may be a portion of a meeting that is conducted in private. That's what the executive session is for. And those are limited to very specific purposes, such as to receive legal advice or for personnel issues. And the executive session still must be part of a publicly noticed meeting. And there is a specific protocol required. So there is a handout in the resources that goes through exactly what protocol to follow for each different situation. It's also important, because public business must be conducted in public, that you don't conduct library board business via phone or email. And there's an article that talks about what it means to be considered business, but you may be advised locally to not send emails to one another and talk about anything that might happen at a board meeting. Even things like scheduling. There may be a person at your library that works at the library that's responsible for scheduling and sends those emails out without allowing an opportunity for discussion between board members. And that's just to make sure there's no accidental discussion of library board business via phone or via email. And then committees are a little bit different. So if you have a committee that has 2 or fewer trustees on it, you don't need to have a public meeting, but some libraries do anyways, just in the interest of transparency, or they at least announce that the meeting is happening, but it may not be open to the public because it is too small. There's no decisions being made at that meeting. Everything would theoretically be going back to the library board for final approval. Now, it's really important to follow this open meetings law, because a violation of the law can result in the library having to pay legal fees and reversal of decisions that were made if open meeting law wasn't followed correctly. And so it's really important to pay attention to these things. I know with a library advisory board, it might seem like, well, there aren't as many critical decisions that are being made in those meetings, but it's still important to adhere to this law, keep public business out in the public, and follow the rules here. So, now also we have the Colorado Open Records Act. So I want to talk a little bit about this as well, another important law to follow related to the open meetings law. And this purpose is, it is declared to be the public policy of the state that all public records shall be open for inspection by any person at reasonable times, except as provided in this in the law, or as otherwise specifically provided by law. And so again, public business, public records must be open to inspection by any person is kind of the purpose of this law. Now, the letter of the law, to get into the details, anyone may request access to public records, and each entity, each municipality, county, library district, special district, each entity must have a custodian of public records, and that varies depending on the size of the organization or the entity. And so for a municipal or county library, this may actually reside within another department of the city or county government, not actually within the library itself. Now, failure to respond to a CORA request in a timely manner can result in fines and legal fees. There are exclusions for information that is otherwise confidential. So see the handout for a complete list. There is a handout that lists out all of the exclusions. But board correspondence, including emails and text messages, is subject to CORA requests. So that's one reason why, if you have a library suggesting that you, if your library is suggesting that you use a separate email address or an email address from the library for your board business, that's why, because it keeps all of your board correspondence in one place rather than having it tied up with your personal messages as well. So executive session recordings are treated differently by law, and they're not subject to a CORA request, but they might be called into question and presented to a judge for consideration. So if there's legitimacy of the CORA request if the legitimacy of the executive session, I should say, is challenged, then a judge might make a determination there that the executive session must be made public. Another really interesting point here is that library user records are protected by law with regards to patron privacy, and we'll look at that more later. So library user records are not subject to a CORA request. They may be subject to other situations where they can be accessed, but not a CORA request specifically. All right, so I wanted to give just a quick overview of a few other areas of the law that are important. Colorado library law, again, is Title 24, Article 90, and has many different sections. It's all related to various aspects of library service at the state and local level. And I just pulled up a few citations here just to call out some of the interesting things that are included in that part of the law. So it includes definitions of different types of libraries. It talks about the formation and establishment of different public library types. There is a clause in there about the abolishment of libraries. And for most types of libraries in Colorado, it actually would require a vote of the people to fully close the library and close it down. And so that's something a lot of people don't know about. It has information about the Board of Trustees of public libraries and also about tax support and elections. And then privacy of user records. We'll look at that later on in more detail because the privacy of user records is a really important aspect of the Colorado library law. There are other Colorado laws that aren't specifically related to libraries, but do impact libraries and their governance and operations. So we've looked at the Open Meeting or Sunshine Act and the Colorado Open Records Act, or CORA. If your library is running any type of campaign or is involved, is related to any type of campaign for a mill levy or sales tax, it's important to be aware of the Fair Campaign Practices Act and what can be done with public resources, meaning staff time and staff resources, paid resources, and what needs to be done on private time. And so Fair Campaign Practices Act is important to know. I'll skip the next two. We've had some changes recently to Tabor and Gallagher Act, so we're not paying attention quite as closely to those in this session, but good to know about the tax-related implications of Colorado law. And then the last two on the list are things that on the surface might not seem directly related to libraries, but influence library policy. And it's important to know about them if you're setting policy. And one of those is the open carry and concealed handguns laws. So in Colorado, local government can choose to prohibit open carry of firearms in their public buildings, for example, such as the library. And but it's important to know that in Colorado, you can't prohibit concealed handguns for those that have a permit. And so it's important if you're setting that sort of policy to make sure not to supersede the law, to infringe on people's rights to carry a concealed handgun if they have the permit to do so, the legal authorization to do so. The last one on the list here is about consumer data protection, and this is just a couple of years old, and it includes some information about having policies for and procedures for data disposal and for notification of individuals if there is a data breach of some sort. And with so much information being online, that's a big concern these days. And so those two areas are ones where the state library actually was able to put out a fact sheet to help with local policy development. So we do that from time to time to help support and not to provide legal advice, but to help make sense of what is in the law so that you can make decisions at the local level and then seek legal advice as you need it. So just a few things to highlight there. And then I also just like to point out that, of course, there are federal laws that relate to library service. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution has a few things within it that relate to our freedom of speech. So that relates to intellectual freedom in the library, both through things like our meeting room use as a public forum, and then also our right to access information and view information and read information. So that's related to our U.S. Constitution. Also, copyright law, which is part of the U.S. Code, relates to not only our lending, our ability to purchase materials and lend them out to others, but also to fair use, which allows for sharing of materials through interlibrary loan and some other circumstances. So just some interesting pieces of federal law that relate to library service. Okay, so I'll keep us moving into the next section where we'll talk about core principles of public library services. Again, this is looking at a pretty high overview just to point out some resources. So don't feel like you need to take all of this in tonight, but it's something you can come back to. I just want you to know that these things exist, and also knowing and recognizing that while some people come to the library board with a great deal of work experience or life experience in libraries, I know others maybe are just a true lover of libraries. And so maybe you haven't had a chance yet to encounter these core principles. And so this is just to help inform your work on the board, your service on the board. So the first of these is our Colorado Public Library Standards, and this is a rather large document. There's a full PDF in the resources, and it's also on the Colorado State Library's website. And these standards provide both some minimum standards for libraries through the definition of a public library section. We'll look at that in a moment. But it also includes, most of what is included is developmental standards. And so the library can use those to examine its current services and to set goals for a better level of service for the local community. And the standards describe best practices for achieving excellence. Each standard has a short introductory section and also a checklist, and can be used as an aid in planning. They can be used to have discussions with library stakeholders and discuss how the library might address certain areas of the standards. It's possible that some of the things that are included in the standards won't apply to every library or won't be a priority right now. And so it's up to the library to look at these and determine what is going to be most meaningful to focus on in the present and kind of the strategic planning future of the library. And one thing that some libraries have done is that at each board meeting through the year, the library director or the board chair might bring one of these standards forward for discussion. Some libraries also do this in like a study session environment, so outside of the regular business meeting, where they can be a little bit more relaxed with the agenda. I just want to reiterate, though, that for the most part, these standards, the state library is not a regulatory agency and is not saying that public libraries have to follow any of these standards. We do have, though, a set of minimum standards for the definition of a public library. And where these definitions, these standards in this definition section come into play is when it comes to state funding. And so often, if the library meets the definition of the public library, there are 13 criteria here that are minimum standards. The library has to meet those areas in order to receive state grant funding. And perhaps other services too. So it can be used in that sense. And I've just pulled out one example here. So there's 4 categories within this definition of a public library. There's 13 criteria. So there's legal responsibilities, library administration and management, access and services, and resource sharing. And one of those that I pulled out here is that the library should provide free access to basic services as defined by written policies regarding lending, borrowing, and circulation services as approved by the library's governing authority. So really just kind of stating that the library should provide basic services for free. And of course, it's funded through taxpayer dollars for the large part, and maybe also some other funds. Another resource, this comes from the American Library Association, and it's the Library Bill of Rights. And this has been written and adopted by library professionals and was first adopted in 1939 and most recently updated in 2019, where they added in the 7th clause, which is about privacy. These are kind of speaking to the idea that libraries are forums for information ideas, and that these basic policies should guide their services towards all people. And item 5 or clause 5 that's included here is a person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views. So really just stating the fundamental idea that libraries are for everyone, and no one should be prohibited from using the library based on those things. So So that's the Library Bill of Rights, something that's just great to know about. Another thing that's interesting is that there's many interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights as it relates to specific aspects of library service. So if you really want to get into this in more detail, you can read these longer documents that will take a look at, for example, collection access, or technology access, or youth access, or privacy. So it gets into more detail on those issues. Another resource that comes from the American Library Association is the Freedom to Read Statement. And this is, I'm not going to read all of this, and this is just a short snippet of it, but this is something that really talks about how our freedom to read is essential to democracy, it's related to democracy, and that there are individuals and groups that try to censor materials in public and in school libraries, and that they might label content as controversial or objectionable, and that try to purge that content from libraries, and really stating that the role of the library is to provide access to all information, not to limit or censor what should be out there. And so there's also a complementary freedom to view statement, which relates to media. This was first issued in 1953 and most recently updated in 2004. Now here we come back to our privacy of user records law here in Colorado, in the Colorado Revised Statutes. This is part of Colorado library law. And this is so important that I am going to actually go through this, through most of it with you, to really highlight what's important here. And again, privacy is an essential value of libraries, and it relates really closely to our intellectual freedom rights. Without privacy, we're not really free as individuals to read or view information. If we think that we might be under surveillance, if we think that others might be looking at what we're reading and making judgments about it, then what we're checking out from the library, then that's going to limit our access to that information. And so privacy is really, really essential. And that's why it's included in our law here in Colorado. And so it says, except as set forth in the next section of this law, a publicly supported library shall not disclose any record or other information that identifies a person as having requested or obtained specific materials or service, or as otherwise having used the library. And so it just broadly defines what it means by the patron user record. And then it goes on to state some exceptions. So there are 4 listed in the law. It says that, records may be disclosed in the following instances. A, if it's necessary for the reasonable operation of the library. And so an example of this is that, in order for certain functions in the library to work, there has to be some sharing of information with perhaps third-party vendors. And we want to work with those vendors still to make sure the privacy is protected, especially through consumer data protection law and also through our own patron privacy standards in libraries. But there might be some need to disclose some of that information in order to make those connections to electronic resources work. Upon written consent of the user, so if someone wants to allow someone else in their household to access their library record, then they can do that. They can provide written consent for that. And then C, pursuant to a subpoena, court order, or where otherwise required by law. So of course, if there is a legal proceeding, if there's an investigation, then there is due process through these channels. Subpoena, court order, not just because someone comes in and asks for it, but they have to have some documentation that says that there is a due process being followed for that investigation. And of course, a library would want to support that law enforcement effort. And then D, to a custodial parent or legal guardian, and this is where it's very specific here, who has access to a minor's library card or its authorization number for the purpose of accessing by electronic means the library records of the minor. So meaning that now that we've moved into this age where our library records are online, a parent or legal guardian can access it if they've got the library card, they've got the information in order to access it. But it doesn't say that the library would just disclose that to the parent just because they had the card. The parent would have to access it electronically themselves. And so So again, that's all of my understanding of the law. And of course, if you have concerns at your library, then you certainly want to seek some legal advice to make sure your policies are in line with the law. But a lot of libraries, say that they adopt this law or cite this law in their policy. And sometimes they also offer further explanation about the way that they go about protecting patron privacy through their policies as well. All right, and we've got just one more slide here before we get into our questions and discussion for this final section. And it was just to look at a few public library trends at a very high level. These are not trends like new technologies or latest service models, but it's really looking at larger trends that are influencing communities and that libraries are adapting to. And so we'll just briefly touch on each of these, again, just to raise your awareness that these are trends that exist right now and things to be thinking about as you think about the future of your library, strategic planning, the policy setting for your library. So the first is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is something that our national associations, including the Public Library Association, has been calling on public library workers to commit to structural change and to take action to end systemic racism and injustice. This is something that at the national level, there's a lot of call to action for. And public libraries have really a unique ability to bring people together and bring knowledge together. And so really trying to help libraries achieve their mission of openness and inclusiveness for access through considering equity, diversity, and inclusion. And of course, there is a growing body of research that shows the ways in which inequity is persisting across the United States, how it is hurting our communities and our organizations. And so in order to provide universal access for all, libraries really have to think about a priority to address equity, diversity, and inclusion into the future. The second item on this trends list is the COVID-19 pandemic. Here we are over a year into the pandemic that started in March of 2020 here in Colorado, at least. And libraries, it was back in March 17th of 2020 when libraries first began closing their doors here in Colorado. And, most public libraries have begun to reopen, at least to some extent now, but there's still a lot of safety precautions in place and changes to the way we're delivering programs, as it is still not safe to gather in groups. And libraries are trying to find, at least indoors in groups, and libraries are trying to find ways to really address, the needs of the community, while also paying attention to the safety needs that have been put on us with the pandemic. And so that's been something that has been an important trend to follow, and not sure where that's going to lead us still. Patron privacy is the third item on this list. And of course, we've talked about that quite a bit. And I'll just reiterate that with so much of our information being online, the threat to patron privacy and our need for more data protection has increased. And so it's something that is being talked a lot about in the library world. And the last is digital inclusion. And, so much of what we're doing now, even more now in the last year with the pandemic, is done online. We're having Zoom and virtual meetings and, not meeting face-to-face anymore, and students are going to school online, and it's really shown how deep our digital divide still is, both in terms of access to high-speed internet and technology, and also the skills that are needed to successfully navigate the internet. And so libraries for a long time have been working in this area to help teach technology and be a part of providing internet access, and I think that continues today, and that we're seeing new waves of what is needed there, and also new waves of the way that libraries are addressing this issue in their communities. And then this is something just related to trends. The ALA has something called the Center for the Future of Libraries. So if this is an area that interests you, I would encourage you to check out their website. The link is included in the resources, and they have many more high-level trends that they're tracking, and a really neat system of organizing all of that. All right, so we're moving into the wrap-up. I have just a moment of reflection, and again, I hope you'll stay on the line just for a few more minutes to get through the announcements so you're aware of the other resources we have available for you. But I always like to close with a reflection, and I know I've covered a lot of information. We've looked at things at a very high level tonight, and I just want you to think, what is one thing that you learned today that you will incorporate into your library board work moving forward? And you don't need to share that with me. You might jot it down. on a piece of paper so that you remember it for later on. But this is just for you to think. What is something that you're taking with you today that you are going to incorporate into your work? Maybe to share with others. Maybe it's to learn a little bit more about, or maybe it is to apply to the work your board is doing in one of these areas. So again, I will send you an email. It'll come tomorrow that will have resources from this session, things that I've mentioned, things you may want to follow up on. And there will be a few attachments and a link to a folder in Google. You won't need to log in to access it. If you have any issues accessing it, please just let me know. But lots of other resources there that you may want to access and continue learning. So, or just be a good reference in case you need it. Also, if you are not already familiar with it, we have a newsletter for trustees that comes out monthly, the Trustee Corner, and also the COLT, Colorado Library Trustee email list. And that email list is just a one-directional from the state library, 2 to 4 emails per month, letting you know about important things that are coming up, training opportunities, and when the Trustee Corner gets released each month. So you can sign up for that online, and I will send that link as well. You will get all of this again in an email tomorrow, so please stay tuned for that. And if you don't get it from me within about 24 hours, let me know. So I just want to thank you again for joining me tonight. Here is my contact information, my email address and phone number. I hope you will stay in touch if you do have follow-up questions. But I just really appreciate you taking this time on a weeknight to learn more about your role as a library trustee. And I hope it was time well spent for you. Thank you for what you do for your library and the community. I mean, it's such an essential role to have dedicated trustees for the library. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.